In our first programme, we suggested that the main problem in acting Shakespeare is how to marry an Elizabethan text and acting tradition with a modern acting tradition. Two of the main points we made were first that the heightened language has to be found by the actor and not just taken for granted, and secondly, that a right balance has to be found between naturalistic and heightened elements in the text. But most of the plays are also in verse, or else very often in heightened rhetorical prose. Blank verse is probably the very centre of the Elizabethan tradition, and perhaps the most important thing in Shakespeare that an actor has to come to terms with. Or rather, I should say that an actor needs to get help from. I stress that because many actors, particularly if they're not familiar with Shakespeare, very understandably look at the verse as some kind of threat. They know they will somehow come to grief if they ignore it, or be chastised if they do it wrong. It becomes a mountain to be climbed, or else an obstacle to be avoided. But no, it's there to help the actor. It's full of little hints from Shakespeare about how to act a given speech or scene. It's a stage direction in shorthand. So let's try to find out how his verse works. Don't let's ask what it is, for it's nothing static, but let's ask what goes on in it. Shakespeare was an actor, and his verse is above all a device to help the actor. It doesn't necessarily or always have something to do with poetry, though it often does. But at the beginning, we can forget that. Now, how do you all think that it helps you as actors?
Well, it helps the actor to learn the lines.
It helps to give him his phrasing.
Blank verse makes a pattern on the page which is easier for the mind to retain.
And it's also full of directorial hints.
Mm-hmm.
And because verse is a more economical way than prose of saying something, it's likely to be more concise and more particular and exact. And at the same time, because a verse has a rhythm to it, a flow, it's perhaps more attractive to the audience to listen to and helps the actor to keep the attention of the audience.
And the punctuation gives you your naturalistic breathing spaces, which also helps to release the meaning of the line and also gives you clues to the emotional state that your character is in.
So it gives you a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, but you're all talking about verse. But what we mean is not verse in the usual sense of rhymes or couplets or other verse forms, which Shakespeare only uses very rarely, but blank verse.
Good, blank verse, quite right. Shakespeare's verse is sometimes called iambic pentameters, which is a horrible phrase, and I don't like to use it. But what it means, and what blank verse means, is basically alternating light and strong stresses, like this rhythm, di-dum, 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 di-dum. Now, it's often been pointed out that this verse form approximates more closely than any other verse form to our natural everyday speech. In fact, it's actually quite easy to pick up blank verse in everyday conversations, or in a book, a paper, or a telly.
You've just said one. Or in a book, a paper, or the telly.
Well, that's not a very immortal line. But as we've said it, I suppose I should point out that it's a line with an extra light stress at the end, which we call a feminine ending. So that's part of our equipment. Let's now look at two examples of unconscious blank verse in context of speech and literature. First of all, here is Mrs. Siddons, the 18th century actress, commenting on the drink she has ordered.
I asked for porter and you gave me beer.
And now, from Dickens, the very end of David Copperfield.
Oh, Agnes, O my soul, so may thy face be by me when I close my life indeed.
I suppose the best way to show why blank verse is such a good verse form for dramatic speech is just to look at one or two of the verse forms used in English drama before Shakespeare. Mike, give us a bit of a miracle cycle.
All hail, both blithe and glad, for here come I, a merry lad. Pray cease your din, my master bad, or else the devil will you speed.
Doggerel, not speech. Those lines have 8 syllables with 4 strong stresses, which is a bit short to accommodate our normal speech rhythms. So now let's hear another rhythm.
O doleful day, unhappy hour, that loving child should see his father dear before his face thus put to death should be.
A rollicking jingle. Again, not speech. There are 14 syllables there and 7 strong stresses. The lines are obviously much too long for our normal speech rhythms.
Thank you, John. Yet, Father, give me blessing thine, and let me once embrace thy comely corpse in folded arms, and kiss thy ancient face.
Thank you. Blank verse, with its 10 syllables, is much closer to the way that we actually talk. In fact, Shakespeare often uses it as a vehicle for naturalistic speech, as in Antonio's "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." As I've said, blank verse doesn't necessarily lead to anything to do with poetry, though it often does. Its natural bias is, I believe, towards the naturalistic. I said that a blank verse line normally goes de-dum, 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 de-dum. But actually, with Shakespeare, that often isn't true. It sometimes does, but perhaps more often it doesn't. Mike, give us a line that doesn't.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more.
Now try to scan it as an iambic pentameter.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more.
Which is totally unnatural. Obviously, it's not written that way, so how do the stresses come naturally?
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more.
7 strong stresses. What is Shakespeare doing there? Well, we can ask ourselves what Henry V is doing. What's his intention? To persuade his soldiers to go back into the breach. A tired, out-of-breath leader desperately trying to reach out to and rally his men. And the strongly overstressed lines reinforce this. It's what I'd call a piece of direction by Shakespeare. Do it again.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead.
Good. Now, the point I want to make is that blank verse as such is neutral. Shakespeare gets his dramatic effects by setting up a norm and then significantly breaking it. Where he breaks that norm, an added stress is provided. Let's take the speech now a few lines further.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead.
Walls up stressed.
In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man.
A regular line.
As modest stillness and humility.
Also pretty regular.
But when the blast of war blows in our ears.
Blows especially stressed there.
Then imitate the action of the tiger.
Pretty regular with a feminine ending.
Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood.
Stiffen and summon, strongly stressed on the offbeat position, part of Henry's pleading.
Disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage.
And there's an antithesis between fair and hard-favoured by put in the offbeat position.
John, don't you think you better explain what you mean by antithesis?
Quite right. It's a key word and we're going to come up against it a great deal. By antithesis, I mean the setting of one word against another. Disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage. The setting up is of one word against its opposite meaning. For instance, to be or not to be. You see now how it works. The iambic pentameter, di-dum, 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 is the norm which Shakespeare keeps more or less going back to, but an extra stress is provided by putting the stressed word in an offbeat rather than the normal position. So we get the rhythm dum-dee rather than di-dum. Counterpoint. It's like in contrapuntal music. So we can say Shakespeare uses blank verse by first setting up a norm and then significantly breaking it.
There's a very heavily stressed line in Winter's Tale of Paulina where Leontes is questioning the goodness of Hermione, and he says mockingly, "Good queen." And she says, "Good queen, my lord, good queen, I say good queen."
Yes, that's a very special line, because I would argue that that has 10 strong stresses out of 10.
Right.
Good queen, my lord, good queen, I say good queen. And you see that the three goods are given extra stress by being put in what I've just called the contrapuntal position. Good queen, dum dum. Yes, but of course there are some occasions where you get fewer stresses and the words become stronger because there are fewer strong words to notice in a line.
There is a tide in the affairs of men.
See, this is a regular line, except that there are only 4 strong stresses. There is a tide in the affairs of men. 4, not 5. Let's take another example.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them.
There, in the second and the third and the fourth lines, there are only 4 stresses, not 5. And at the end of the first 4 lines, there's also an 11th syllable, a feminine ending. Sometimes Shakespeare uses this extra syllable as a light stress and not as a strong one, and therefore it's a misscansion to give a feminine ending a strong stress. Let's have an example of that.
How might a prince of my great hopes forget, so great indignities you laid upon me?
It just sounds wrong to stress the feminine ending here. Try.
As in, so great indignities you laid upon me.
Good. Now, there are a number of other Shakespearean usages which are even more telling. One is a short verse line. If a line is only, say, 6 or 7 syllables, we can be pretty sure that the missing syllables are taken up by a pause of some sort. But I mustn't lecture about it. Let's open up things a bit now and start acting some of the passages rather than talking about them. So spread yourselves out a bit. And David and Lisa, let's do a few lines from the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice. Okay? The trial.
Oh, wise and upright judge, how much more elder art thou than thy looks?
Therefore lay bare your bosom.
Aye, his breast, so says the pond, doth it not, noble judge, nearest his heart. Those are the very words.
It is so. Are there balance here to weigh the flesh?
I have them ready.
Have by some surgeon, Shylock, on your charge, to stop his wounds, lest he do bleed to death.
You see how Portia and Shylock have 2 short verse lines. It is so, and I have them ready. 3 and 5 syllables respectively. Now, a short line in Shakespeare usually suggests a pause. So what do both of you think the specific function of these 2 short lines is?
Well, in this particular case, there's a choice. You can either hear pause before the utterance or after it.
Mm-hmm.
And the choice you have to take is one which stems out, which is arising out of the actual emotional state you are in the scene. For instance, there are 2 ways of playing Portia in the scene conventionally. One is that she doesn't know what she's doing and is winging it. Or you can say it's a moral choice, that she's desperately trying to get through to him.
That's right. So it is decision, actor's choice in this case, because Shylock, because of his state, his emotional state and his confidence, is in no doubt about what he's doing at all, so he can come right in on cue.
Yes.
The balance here to where I have them ready.
Yes, that's
Now
right.
it's up to you again.
That's right.
There's another interesting thing too, because they actually share a line. Therefore lay bare your bosom, I his breast, he says, which
Yes.
is also something.
A shared verse line between two characters is a terrifically important point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because what it says is, pick up the cue.
Then
Don't pause.
Then there's very little choice.
Yeah.
There is no choice.
No.
I think when Shakespeare breaks up a verse line between two speakers, it almost invariably means pick the cue up. Otherwise he wouldn't do it.
And also the pause after I have them ready, the next pause that Portia's been given is interesting because she ends up, lest you do bleed to death, it's really the strongest clue she's giving to Shylock, that actually he's heading for desperate trouble.
That's right. Clue is a good word because we can never be 100% certain, can we? There are clues in the text that we have to be detectives with. We can't always be 100% certain, but that doesn't matter. The important thing is that we ask the question and we play the detective, and usually we can find the answer in the text.
John, when you say pick up the cue at once, what I understand it to mean is think faster. Because I know a lot of people, myself included, when we first come to Shakespeare, because of method acting or whatever, we tend to put in a lot of pauses into Shakespeare when we think the thought and then we speak it. And I think pick up the cue at once just means speak as you think faster, not speak faster, but think faster.
Yes, think faster, that's absolutely right. I think that what you've just said is actually the most important thing that we've said so far in this programme. I think it's marvellous and absolutely vital. And it's pretty certain, isn't it, that Shakespeare's actors played the text a good deal quicker and tighter than we do. Our naturalistic bias makes us use a larger number of pauses, both at the end of the line and within it. Now, let's go on looking at the device of the shared verse line and take the famous example, which is from King John, when the king suggests murder to an accomplice.
Death.
My lord.
A grave.
He shall not live.
Enough.
Good. That's the example. Now, what do you think the verse is doing there?
Well, we've got two verse lines. The first one has only got one word in it, death, and the second verse line is complete, my lord, a grave he shall not live, enough.
Right. So, what do we think about taking it as you did, which I liked, and the other possibility, which would be doing it with pregnant pauses?
Well, I remember when we did do it with pregnant pauses, actually. Not together, not because I know you wouldn't do that. But I remember Emrys was in rehearsal, and Emrys was playing the king, and I was playing Hubert, and it started with he said death, and then moved right away, and I was stood there, and thought about it very carefully. My lord. And then he came round the other side.
No, it's very good.
That's what happened in rehearsal sometimes.
Very good.
A grave, and left her, and I was still laying there. He shall not live. Enough.
Terribly good, isn't it?
And I remember your comments afterwards, which made us do it quickly in the end.
There is another choice, isn't there? Because we've got two verse lines, that you could reasonably take a pause after death at the end of the first verse line.
Yes.
Instead of running the whole thing together. Can we try that? See what happens if you take a pause there.
Yes, try that.
Right.
Death.
My lord.
A grave.
He shall not live.
Enough.
Yeah. I think that's an earned pause.
Yeah.
You see, you spoil it if you have lots and lots of pauses, but if there's one in the right place at the end of the verse line, it's very, very telling.
Yes, and the briefness of it is terrific because they're talking about something which cannot be described, which is the murder of a young child.
That's
Which is
right.
why it's so terse.
You earn that tension after it, rather than between each lengthy, indulgent...
It's what Jane said, thinking on the line instead of between the lines.
That's right. Good. Thank you. Now, let's look at something else the verse does. What about the ends of the lines? Now, the norm here is for the grammatical pause or the end of a clause or a sentence, i.e. the natural place for the actor to take a little break, comes at the end of the verse line. When that happens, the verse is described as end-stopped. So let's go back now to the opening speech of the Merchant of Venice.
In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you. But how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff it is made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn.
4 end-stop lines, and then a short half line, I am to learn. What does that half line suggest to you?
I think when the rhythm of the blank verse enters an actor's soul, as it were, and that rhythm is interrupted because there are no words to complete the line in I am to learn, did-dum, did-dum, did-dum. It just indicates that the mind is going on ticking, although words are not coming out to explain what the thoughts are.
That's right.
Then, of course, you come in with the next line with a bit more of a push because of that.
Yes. I think that's what the short lines do 9 times out of 10. This is also a good example of end-stopped verse. The thoughts and the lines go together, and that's very helpful to an actor when he's learning at speed and mapping it all out in his mind, isn't it?
Yes, and if the speech is a long one and the punctuation indicates that the thoughts are flowing and it is all, in fact, one sentence, the end-stopness of the verse may indicate points where an actor can breathe, if not actually stop speaking. Well, you have to stop speaking when you breathe, but just fractionally stop speaking.
Yes, sometimes there are sentences which take up 14 or 15 lines of verse, and they'd actually be impossible to say if they weren't phrased for us by the verse. Let's listen now to a sonnet which is all one sentence.
When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Good. Now, it would be virtually impossible to say that if it wasn't phrased by the verse. The speaker wouldn't know how to phrase so long a sentence. But what you did there, Sheila, and what the verse did, was to carry us with you, made us listen, go with the story, and actually it didn't seem too long, even though it was a very, very long sentence indeed. It didn't seem like it.
It felt it to me. No, there is one line there, isn't there, where you, where I don't quite know what you should do, is lark arise from sullen earth, where
like
it is actually...
a lark arising, end of line, from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gates.
So what do you do there?
Should you run on, should you not? Well, I would just say what I've just been saying. Ask yourself the question and decide which is better. If it's better for you to run on, run on. If the phrase with it actually helps you, then you must do that. Let's look at an extreme example in a late Shakespeare play, The Winter's Tale. Now, in his later plays, Shakespeare's verse is much less end-stopped, and the lines continually overrun. Here's Leontes, who is mad with jealousy of his wife and friend.
Gone already. Inch thick, knee deep, o'er head and ears, a forked one. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays, and I play too, but so disgraced a part, whose issue will hiss me to my grave. Now, John, there's one line there which is run on. Thy mother plays, and I play too. What about that? It's natural to run it on.
Well, is it? That's the question. You have to ask that question and decide.
Yeah. Now, it's possible to stress the end of the verse line and for it to sound natural, like spontaneous speech. If you stress it here, it begins to sound slightly unnatural. For instance, thy mother plays and I play too. And yet, to stress it in that way might be telling us something about Leontes.
Well, of course, you could stress it that way if you went for the play and said, and I play too, if you picked out that theatre metaphor.
Go play, boy, play.
Yeah.
Thy mother plays and I play too.
That's possible, isn't it? It is possibilities. There aren't laws. All I'm saying is one has to judge it and ask the question each time and then decide. This passage also contains another very common Shakespeare usage, which is a pause in the half line, a grammatical pause in the middle of a verse line.
Go play, boy, play.
Yes.
Full colon, thy mother plays and I.
Go play, boy, play, colon. Now, what do we do about that? Do we pause there or do we run on there?
Yeah, well, I think that the answer is common sense, and it's to do again with character, that if the general tenor of the speech is to do with rapid, teeming thought, then the actor should run it on. After all, we often do when we speak.
That's right. So all the time, if you ask the question, you can find an acting reason for the answer.
Yes, invariably.
Well, now let's see what happens if we take the whole speech and have to decide what we do with both the caesura and the ends of the lines, whether to run on or not, and see what happens if on the whole you phrase it so that you run on at the half line at the caesura, but take your phrasing on the whole at the ends of the lines and see if it sounds natural to you or whether it's a forced exercise.
Yeah, when do I breathe?
When you breathe, that's the point. You breathe at the end of the verse line. Very often, I believe, Shakespeare put in things in blank verse to help actors phrase out of doors where their breath needed control more than in an indoor theatre. People have said that's one reason why verse was used.
All right, and if I'm going to do that, I'm going to need great breaths because I'm going to run on a lot of lines on one breath.
That's right. Have a go.
All right. Gone already. Inch thick. Knee deep. Oh, head and ears, a forked one. Go play, boy, play. Thy mother plays, and I play too. But so disgraced a part, whose issue will hiss me to my grave. Contempt and clamour will be mine, Nell. Go play, boy, play. There have been. Or I'm much deceived. Cuckolds ere now. And many a man there is, even at this present. Now, while I speak this, holds his wife by the arm, little thinks she has been sluiced in his absence, and his pond fished by his next neighbour, by Sir Smile, his neighbour. Nay, there's comfort in't. Whilst other men have gates, and those gates opened as mine against their will, should all despair that have revolted wives, the tenth of mankind would hang itself. Physic for it there's none. 'Tis a bawdy planet that will strike where 'tis predominant. It is powerful, think it, from east, west, north, south. Be it concluded, no barricado for a belly.
I thought that was a wonderful use of verse, because you both had a control and a driving rhythm, and the verse carried us, and yet you weren't tied to it totally. You kept a balance between the two. As if one observes it slavishly, that's a bad thing. If you ignore it totally, that's a bad thing. How did it feel? I thought it was pretty good.
It gave me the sensation of somebody who was beginning to spiral out of control. And in fact, it is characteristic of the play that as Leontes' verse fragments and disintegrates and becomes less and less irregular, so the man himself is breaking up, fragmenting, and becoming less and less rational.
I think that's very good.
But I wonder how much an audience might have followed that, because it seemed to me to be very fast, and it's a complex speech. How much can they possibly take out of it, I wonder?
I think that in all honesty, an audience wouldn't have totally followed what you did, but I thought it was a very healthy stage of work grappling with a really difficult bit of verse, and I thought that the basic balance between going with the verse and having a freedom from it, which you have to have in a late play, was pretty good.
Goody.
Well done. Now, I believe I listed all the main points that an actor needs to know about Shakespeare's verse. It's been a crash course, so I'll come back to them all later on in other examples. But there are some other minor points as well, which we may as well clear up.
John, can we start with elision?
Yes, elision. Very often, a line seems to have more than 10 syllables, but where two vowels come together in a sentence, or in a word, one vowel is scarcely pronounced, and so then, in the scansion of the line, the number of syllables comes down again to 10 as the total number of syllables in the line. Here are some lines of Imogen's from Cymbeline, a late play. She's waking out of a drugged sleep, and she finds a headless body lying beside her. There is your headless body.
Thank you, John. Yes, sir. To Milford Haven. Which is the way? Oh, I thank you. By yon bush. Pray, how far thither? Oh, Spartacus. Can it be 6 miles yet? I've gone all night. Faith, I'll lie down and sleep. Oh, but soft, no bedfellow. Oh, gods and goddesses. These flowers are like the pleasures of the world. This bloody man, the care on't. Oh, I hope I dream. For so I thought I was cave keeper and cook to honest creatures. But 'tis not so.
Good. Well, you did that beautifully. You see, there's a very difficult bit of late verse, but if you go with it as you did, it's actually an opportunity for a piece of naturalistic acting about somebody waking up in an extraordinary situation. Yes. But let's just look now at the elisions that are in that text, because there's a number of them. First of all, yes, sir, Milford Haven, which is the way. Haven, as we say it, becomes one word in the scansion of the line. It's not haven, it's haven. That's the first one. Then the second one, again, in the way we actually speak. I have gone all night turns out to be I've gone all night.
Yes.
Yeah? And then the next one, I'll lie down and sleep, instead of I will lie down and sleep. You see, elision sounds a pompous word, but actually it's to do with naturalistic speech, not something grammatical and abstract. Then the next one is, but soft no bedfellow, O gods and goddesses. Goddesses, two light stresses after goddesses. The two go together.
Goddesses, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, you did actually say it quite close to that when you did the speech. Then the next one is this bloody man, the care on't. Instead of on it, this bloody man, the care on't. And the last one, very simple one, but 'tis not so, but it is not so. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is that virtually all those, you would yourself naturally elide and make an elision yourself if you were saying them in a naturalistic play. What about the pronunciation of particular words? Some words keep cropping up in Shakespeare which were pronounced differently in his day.
Yes, and I think this often gives Shakespeare actors a bad name with the public who don't quite understand why we do use what are now archaic pronunciations. For instance, there's a line in Richard II where he's divesting himself of his majesty, and he says, "My manors, rents, revenues, I forego." We're familiar enough with the word revenue, inland revenue in English tax terms, but you can't say, "My manors, rents, revenues, I forego," because although it has its own sort of rhythm, it's contrary to the rather stately rhythm of the regular blank verse. So if you hear a Shakespearean actor mispronouncing a word, he's actually mispronouncing it because it's what Shakespeare wants rather than what he wants.
Well, it's argued that the old stress is hard for the audience to follow. But is it? I personally believe we should use the old pronunciation partly because the rhythm of the line sounds better, but partly because in context the old pronunciation is often actually easier to say. A good example is in Antony and Cleopatra, when Antony is dead and Cleopatra says she'll kill herself. Show us.
Rather a ditch in Egypt be gentle grave unto me. Rather on Nilus mud lay me stark naked, and let the water flies blow me into abhorring. Rather make my country's high pyramides my gibbet, and hang me up in chains.
Good. Now, we may be used to saying pyramids, but pyramides is clear enough, and the alternative would be a tongue twister. Try doing it as pyramids to see what happens.
Rather make my country's high pyramids my gibbet, and hang me up in chains.
Actually not so easy, is it?
It's difficult. It's difficult to think of the word in the wrong way. I suppose because the blank verse sets up such a rhythm that to go against it, you really have to consciously think of going against it.
That's right. Once one surrenders to it, it's actually easier all the time to go with it and harder to actually break the law against it. I mean, let's take another example and go to another play and do Cressida in Troilus and Cressida, where she's desperate because she's been taken from Troilus, whom she loves, from be moderate, be moderate.
Why tell me of moderation? The grief is fine, full, perfect that I taste, and violenteth in a sense as strong as that which causeth it.
Yes, the crux is violenteth, which you found very difficult to say.
I really have to stop in my line of thought when I get to that word to do it that way.
Let's just listen to it again. The verse line is, and violenteth in a sense as strong. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? But if we scan it as Shakespeare scanned it, it falls into place. So now do it the right way.
It sounds hurried, you see, when you do it the wrong way, and it's like
violenteth
you're snatching at the word and you can't hear what it is.
Yes, violenteth in a sense as strong sounds like a tongue twister. But see what happens if you say violenteth, which is Shakespeare's way.
Why tell me of moderation? The grief is fine, full, perfect that I taste, and violenteth in a sense as strong as that which causeth it.
Yes, well, it is easier, isn't it? That's a very, very good example.
Seems to flow much better.
Yes, very good one. Sometimes there are single bits of pronunciation which don't actually affect the verse like that does, but which actually sound better, aren't they, in Troilus?
Well, I remember you saying that, about Troilus and Cressida, that there's a character that in modern parlance we call Hector. But the Elizabethans would have said Hector, which is a much richer, much more powerful sound than Hector.
Yes, they also pronounced what we call Troilus as Troilus, which sounds more romantic, which probably befits his character. And in that case, Troilus, Shakespeare sometimes scans the word as 2 syllables and sometimes as 3, and it depends on how he uses the word in the verse line at a given moment. So, Ian, come in and do a bit of Troilus with your Cressida.
And is it true that I must go from Troy?
A hateful truth.
What? And from Troilus too?
From Troy and Troilus.
Is it possible?
It is possible.
We've never acted together. We always laugh. That's why we never acted.
You see, it scans differently in the 2 verse lines. A hateful truth, what and from Troilus too, where it counts as
from Troilus too.
2 syllables. And then in the next verse line, from Troy and Troilus is possible, is another verse line. And Shakespeare often does that with his names. He scans them to convenience in his verse line. So maybe there was a bit of correcting of one another on the pronunciation.
Maybe that's why we laughed. Maybe she would laugh.
Do you think it's likely that in Elizabethan times people didn't pronounce their names constantly and had different pronunciations?
No, it's really as in laws of English poetry. Most poets take this license, don't they? And sometimes scan a word one way and sometimes another. Very good. Thanks. Here's an example of how the scansion of the verse makes a big difference to the pronunciation, from the opening soliloquy of Richard III.
Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house, in the deep bosom of the ocean buried.
Now look at the last line and how it scans. In the deep bosom of the ocean buried. There are 11 syllables here, not 10. A buried, therefore, happens to be a feminine ending, and ocean, in the ocean buried, scans simply enough as ocean. But now let's look at a bit from another king, King Henry V, in his once more into the breach speech.
Then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a galled rock, or hang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean.
Now, something funny happens there. Swilled with a wild and wasteful ocean. Rousing stuff, but it seems to peter off at the end. So if we dig into that last line, how does swilled with a wild and wasteful ocean scan? What happens to the word ocean?
Ocean, maybe ocean.
That's right.
Ocean.
So it looks like a 9-syllable line, which is unusual. And if we're to have 10 syllables, we have to make ocean 3 syllables, and surely we're glad to do it in the context because it sounds much better. The whole line is obviously onomatopoeic, and we get the sound of the words giving us the sound of the surge of the sea.
Swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean.
That's right.
John, what about that vexed question of whether we pronounce ED or not?
Well, you have to do a little mathematical sum with the verse line, don't you? You have to see how it scans as 10 syllables, and then you have the answer. If we take 2 lines from a speech we've just looked at, let's have...
Disguise fair nature with hard favoured rage.
A favoured is 2 syllables. Now listen to another.
As fearfully as doth the gore-led rock.
You have to say galled if the line is going to scan properly. It's not just a matter of purism. Again, as with what we did with Cressida and Jane, if you misscan it, it's going to sound odd.
As fearfully as doth the gold rock.
Sounds like a bit of a hiccup again, doesn't it?
As we've had lots of little examples, let's watch and listen to some swift-flowing passage. Let's take a piece of ding-dong dialogue where 2 actors will get lost if they don't go with the rhythm of the text. Richard III is wooing the Lady Anne over the dead body of King Henry VI.
Didst thou not kill this king?
I grant ye, yea.
Dost grant me, hedgehog? Then God grant me too thou mayst be damned for that wicked deed. Oh, he was gentle, mild, and virtuous.
The better for the King of Heaven that hath him.
He is in heaven, where thou shalt never come.
Well, let him thank me that hoped to send him thither, for he's fitter for that place than earth.
And thou unfit for any place but hell.
Yes, one place else if you will hear me name it.
Some dungeon.
Your bedchamber.
Rest betide the chamber where thou liest.
So will it, madam, till I lie with you.
I hope so.
No, sir. But gentle Lady Anne, is not the causer of these timeless deaths as blameful as the executioner?
Thou wast the cause and most accursed effect.
Thy beauty was the cause of that effect.
If I thought that, I tell thee, homicide, these nails would rend that beauty from my cheeks.
Your eyes could not endure that beauty's rack, as all the world is cheered by the sun, so I by that. It is my day, my life.
Black night will shade thy day, and death thy life.
Curse not thyself, fair creature, thou art both.
I would I were to be revenged on thee.
It is a quarrel most unnatural to be revenged on him that loveth thee.
It is a quarrel just and reasonable to be revenged on him that killed my husband.
He that bereft thee, lady, of thy husband, did it to help thee to a better husband.
His better does not breathe upon the earth.
He lives to love thee better than he could.
Name him.
Plantagenet.
Why, that was he.
The self-same neighbour won a bed of nature.
Where is he?
Here. Why dost thou spit on me?
Would it were mortal poison for thy sake.
Never came poison from so sweet a place.
Never hung poison on a fouler toad. Out of my sight. Thou dost infect mine eyes.
Thine eyes, sweet lady, have infected mine.
Good. Very good.
John, all these things we've been talking about could be a bit daunting. How conscious should one be of the verse in performance?
Well, I think the rule should be very conscious of the verse in rehearsal and don't think about it in performance. I suppose it should work there on the subconscious and you've got it into the system and help you that way, but not consciously. There is, I think, one other rule. If you decide in rehearsal that you want to go against the verse, of course you must be free to do so. But if you ignore it, I think an actor should do it knowingly. You don't just overlook it. Try to ask first if following the verse actually isn't better. Because you must never forget that Shakespeare's put it there to help you. That's what I think the centre of what the verse is about. Anyway, what do you think?
Well, that sounds a bit as though it's eliminating spontaneity and performance in a way. I mean, you're saying that one has to get the pattern of the verse in your head.
But all of acting is a balance between the worked out and the spontaneous, isn't it? It's part of that.
I think what's pretty, revolutionary about what you're saying is that most people, when they go and see Shakespeare, expect somehow to be able, in the audience, to hear that the actors are speaking verse and relate it to what they know of poetry from poems they've learnt at school. And, of course, you can sit through a whole Shakespeare play without being aware that it's written in verse at all. The verse you keep stressing, and I absolutely agree, the verse is there to help the actors and not for the audience to wallow in something vaguely poetic.
That's right. There's the awful old idea that we come to the theatre to hear verse.
Yes.
We don't.
And we don't want the audience, as they're sitting through a play, to be aware of all this work that we've done. We must have absorbed it so that what we're saying is easier to listen to and more understandable and more beautiful and more precise.
That's right. Absolutely.
But how often have we seen when something goes wrong, when an actor forgets his lines, whether it's one word or a whole speech, that the ad-lib, when it comes out, will come out in the verse form, because it has become so ingrained that although he may select different words, the rhythm will remain constant.
And equally, if you forget your words and you substitute with a one-syllable word where it should be a two-syllable word, it's like an electric shock, actually.
That's right.
It's awful.
Yes.
But with the verse, there is that very difficult stage in rehearsal where, as you say, you start off by being aware of the verse, and it's up to that moment that you break through that awareness so that it doesn't impede your actual character and your relationships with other people. It can stay there sometimes too long, and you've got to get rid of it to release other areas of the play, relationships and the rest of it, and you've got to go through that.
That's right. I feel very self-conscious expositing verse like the way I've been doing it, because I know that's not really what it's about. That's all stuff that's got to get into your subconscious, and then you've got to throw it away. And I think that would lead me to making one final point, because I'm not for a moment, of course, suggesting that Shakespeare worked it all out consciously himself in the way that we've been analysing it today. On the whole, I'm sure that he wrote intuitively, which is why sometimes his own lines misscan, and it's up to us to analyse it. But in the end, we must trust it intuitively like he did. I think that's the basic rule of the whole thing. It wasn't planned. It was organic. I mean, we have two contemporary references on his fluency as a writer, which perhaps worth ending with. One's by Hemming and Cundall, the two actors in his company and editors of the first folio.
His mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot on his papers.
And Ben Jonson, his friend and rival playwright, wrote,
"He flowed with that facility that sometimes it was necessary he should be stopped."
A good moral. So with the analysis of his verse, sometimes it is necessary that it should be stopped.